There's a moment that most people never question, because it feels too normal to be dangerous. It's that quiet agreement you make with life, where you trade your time for money and call it stability. You wake up, you work, you get paid, you repeat. It looks responsible. It sounds mature. It even feels safe. Until you notice that no matter how long you keep doing it, nothing really changes. The strange part isn't that people work. The strange part is how deeply they believe that working harder will eventually solve everything. That one day, after enough effort, enough stress, enough hours stacked on top of each other, something will finally shift. But it rarely does. The numbers may grow a little. The responsibilities definitely do. And the cycle quietly tightens around you without making a sound. Solomon never lived like that. Yet not because he avoided effort, but because he understood something most people never stop to see. Money earned from time disappears with time. And if your entire life depends on that exchange, then your life is always one interruption away from collapsing. It doesn't matter how disciplined you are or how committed you feel. If your income stops when you stop, then you're not building. You're maintaining a fragile balance. And fragile things don't last. There's a difference between earning money and building something that produces money. It's subtle at first, almost invisible. But once you see it, it becomes impossible to ignore. One requires your constant presence. The other continues even when you're not there. One drains you slowly. The other starts feeding you back. Solomon paid attention to that difference. Yet he didn't structure his life around effort alone. He structured it around flow, around systems, around positioning. While most people were focused on earning the next coin, he was focused on creating paths through which coins would continue to move, whether he was present or not. And that changes everything, because now time is no longer your enemy. Time becomes your ally. But most people never reach that point, because they're too busy surviving the structure they've accepted. They don't question it. They adapt to it. They get better at it. They even become proud of how much they can endure. And endurance starts to look like success, even when nothing is actually growing. You can spend years becoming excellent at something that will never free you. And that's the quiet trap. Not failure, not laziness, not lack of ambition, a just misdirection. Because when your entire focus is on earning, you rarely have the space to think about building. Your energy is consumed by the immediate. Bills, deadlines, expectations. And slowly, without noticing, you start designing your life around reacting instead of creating, around maintaining instead of expanding. Solomon didn't rush like that. He observed patterns. He understood cycles. He paid attention to how value moved, not just how it was earned. And more importantly, he understood that wealth isn't something you chase. It's something you structure, something you position yourself around, something that grows because the system allows it to grow. And that's where most people feel uncomfortable. Because building requires patience. It requires stepping back while everyone else is rushing forward. It requires saying no to certain opportunities that look good in the short term, but keep you locked in the same loop. And that kind of decision doesn't feel safe at first. It feels slow. It feels uncertain. But what feels safe is often what keeps you stuck. There's also another layer that people rarely admit. Working for money gives you a sense of control. You do something, you get paid. It's predictable, immediate, clean. Building something, on the other hand, doesn't always reward you right away. It asks for trust. It asks for vision. It asks you to move without immediate proof. And that's where most people stop. Not because they can't build, but because they don't stay long enough to see the result. They return to what feels certain, to what responds instantly, to what confirms their effort quickly, and without realizing it. And they reinforce the very structure that limits them. Solomon saw beyond that. He wasn't just thinking about today's outcome. He was thinking about continuity, about what remains, about what grows quietly in the background while life moves forward. And when you start thinking like that, your decisions change. Your priorities shift. Your attention moves away from constant effort and towards strategic placement. You stop asking, "How can I earn more this month?" And you start asking, "What can exist without me constantly feeding it?" That question changes the direction of everything. Because now, you're not just working, you're designing. You're not just reacting, you're creating space. And slowly, the pressure that once defined your life begins to loosen. Not because you stopped working, but because your work started to multiply instead of reset every time the month ended. And this is where most people begin to notice something uncomfortable. They realize they've been running in a loop for years, maybe decades, always moving, always doing, always earning, but never actually stepping out of the cycle. And the hardest part isn't changing the strategy. It's accepting that the strategy was never leading where they thought it would. That realization can feel heavy. But it's also the first moment of clarity. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. You start noticing patterns everywhere. You start recognizing who is trading time and who is building systems. You start seeing why some people seem to move differently, speak differently, decide differently. It's not luck, it's structure. And structure can be changed. Well, it's not overnight, not instantly, but intentionally. Solomon didn't escape effort. He redirected it. He placed it where it could grow instead of disappear. And that's the shift most people are avoiding without even realizing it. Not because it's impossible, but because it requires a different way of seeing, not just a different way of doing. And seeing differently changes everything. You start noticing it in small moments first, like when you finally get paid. And instead of relief, there's this quiet calculation already running in your head. What needs to be paid? What's left? What's coming next? And that money, the one you worked so hard for, already feels like it belongs somewhere else before it even reaches you. It never really lands. And that's when something subtle begins to crack. Because deep down, you realize you're not building anything. You're just passing things through your hands. Money comes in, money goes out. Effort goes in, exhaustion comes out. And the cycle continues, almost perfectly designed to keep you moving without ever letting you advance. That's not an accident. It's a structure. And once you see that, yet you can't ignore the next question that quietly follows. Who benefits from you staying inside it? Because when your life is fully dependent on earning before you can live, you're always in a position of urgency. You can't pause. You can't step back. You can't think long term, because the short term is always demanding your attention. And urgency has a way of stealing your ability to see clearly. Solomon understood that urgency is the enemy of wisdom, not because things shouldn't be done, but because when everything feels urgent, nothing is strategic. You react, you rush, you accept. And slowly, your decisions stop being intentional and start becoming necessary. And necessity rarely leads to freedom. It leads to repetition. That's why two people can work just as hard for just as long and end up in completely different places. One builds something that starts to carry itself. The other remains stuck in a system that resets every month, no matter how much effort was poured into it. Same effort, different direction. And direction is what changes outcomes. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because shifting direction doesn't always mean doing something completely new. Sometimes it means looking at what you're already doing and realizing it was never designed to take you where you thought it would. that the path itself was limited from the start. That realization hits differently. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It's quiet. Almost like a thought you try to ignore at first. But it stays there. It keeps returning. In moments of silence. In moments of fatigue. In moments where you ask yourself why it still feels like you're starting over. And even after everything you've done. And that's where the real shift begins. Not in action, but in awareness. Because once you become aware of the pattern, you stop romanticizing it. You stop calling it normal. You stop convincing yourself that this is just how life works. And instead, you start questioning the rules you've been following without even realizing it. Why does income need to depend on presence? Why does effort need to reset every month? Why does stability feel so temporary? Those questions don't come with immediate answers, but they open something. They create space, and space is where new structures begin to form. Solomon didn't accept systems blindly. He observed them. He tested them. He understood that if something constantly demands more from you without giving you room to grow beyond it, then it's not a system designed for your expansion. It's a system designed for your participation. And participation alone doesn't build wealth. It sustains systems. That's why so many people feel like they're always close to something, but never actually reaching it. Because they are participating in a structure that rewards continuity, not transformation. It rewards showing up, not stepping out. And stepping out feels risky, because it removes the illusion of certainty. But what if that certainty was never real to begin with? What if the paycheck you rely on isn't security, but dependency? What if the thing you trust the most is the very thing limiting your options? Those are not comfortable questions, but they're necessary ones. Because without them, nothing changes. You just optimize the same cycle. Yet you get slightly better results, slightly more income, slightly more comfort. But the structure remains the same. And over time you realize that improvement inside a limited system still keeps you limited. Solomon didn't aim to improve the cycle. He stepped outside of it. Not in a reckless way, not in a desperate move, but in a deliberate shift. He started placing his effort into things that didn't disappear once completed. Things that remained. Things that accumulated. Things that continued. And once that shift happens, something else changes too. Your relationship with time. Time stops feeling like something you're constantly running out of, and starts feeling like something you can actually use. Because now, not everything depends on what you do today. Some things depend on what you built yesterday, and others are quietly growing for tomorrow. That creates a different kind of calm. Not the calm of having everything figured out, but the calm of knowing you're no longer stuck in a loop that resets your life every month. And that's where the real difference starts to show. Because once you step into that space, going back becomes harder than moving forward. Not because forward is easy, but because now you've seen too much to pretend the old way still makes sense. There's a moment that doesn't look like a breakthrough. It doesn't come with clarity, or motivation, or even confidence. It feels more like discomfort, like something inside you no longer enkikes the way it used to. The routine is still the same. The work is still there. The structure hasn't changed, but your perception of it has. And that's where things start to shift in a way that's hard to explain. Because now, it's not just about what you're doing. It's about what you've been accepting without noticing. The agreements you made with life without ever questioning them. The silent decisions that shaped your days, your priorities, your limits. And once you see those, you start seeing yourself differently too. Not as someone trapped, but as someone who adapted. That hits deeper than blaming the system. And because adapting means you participated in it. You learned its rules. You optimized yourself to survive inside it. You became efficient at something that was never meant to set you free. And in a strange way, that realization can feel heavier than the system itself. Because now, it's personal. It's not just about what's out there. It's about what's been happening inside you all along. The way you measure your worth through productivity. The way you associate rest with guilt. The way you feel uneasy when you're not doing something that leads to immediate return. Those patterns don't come from nowhere. They are built slowly, reinforced daily, rewarded subtly, until one day they feel like your personality, when in reality, they're just conditioning. And Solomon never allowed his identity to be shaped by urgency, as he didn't define himself by how much he could produce in a day. He defined himself by what he could position over time. That's a completely different orientation, one that doesn't rush to prove value, but understands that value compounds when placed correctly. But for someone who has lived inside the cycle for too long, that shift feels unnatural, even threatening. Because if you're not constantly producing, who are you? If you're not chasing the next payment, what do you focus on? If you're not measuring progress by immediate results, how do you know you're moving forward? Those questions don't have quick answers, and that's exactly why most people avoid them. They return to what feels familiar, to what confirms their identity, to what gives them a sense of control, even if that control is limited. But something has already changed. You've seen the pattern, and once that happens, continuing the same way starts to feel heavier than before. What used to feel normal now feels repetitive. What used to feel necessary now feels questionable. And the more you try to ignore it, the more it surfaces in quiet moments. In the drive back home, in the silence before sleep, in that brief pause where you realize you've been moving all day, but not necessarily moving forward. That's not frustration. That's awareness trying to grow. And growth rarely feels comfortable at the beginning, because it asks you to let go of parts of yourself that once felt safe. The version of you that believed effort alone was enough. The version that thought consistency inside the same structure would eventually break the structure itself. It won't. And consistency inside a limited system only deepens your position within it. Solomon understood that before most people even questioned it. He knew that if you keep pouring yourself into something that resets, you don't accumulate. You deplete. And depletion doesn't always show immediately. Sometimes it looks like stability, like routine, like life moving forward. Until you stop and realize that everything still depends on you showing up exactly the same way tomorrow. That's not leverage. That's dependency disguised as responsibility. And breaking that doesn't start with action. It starts with identity. With allowing yourself to not be the person who survives the system, but the one who steps outside of it. Not all at once, not dramatically, but internally first. Quietly, almost invisibly. What you begin to detach from the need to prove your worth through constant effort. You begin to question where your time is going and what it's actually building. You begin to notice opportunities that don't demand your presence every moment, but instead require your attention, your intention, your patience. And that's a different kind of work. Less visible, less immediate, but far more powerful over time. This is where most people hesitate, because there's no applause here, no instant validation, no clear feedback in the beginning, just a sense that you're moving differently, thinking differently, choosing differently, and trusting that difference takes something most people haven't practiced: stillness. Solomon was comfortable with that. He didn't rush to fill every gap with action. He allowed space for observation. and for understanding, for alignment. And that's where his decisions came from. Not from pressure, not from urgency, but from clarity. And clarity doesn't come to those who are constantly reacting. It comes to those who step back long enough to see the whole. That's what you're starting to do now, even if it doesn't feel complete, even if it still feels uncertain, even if part of you wants to go back to what feels easier. Because easier is familiar, but familiar is what kept everything exactly the same. And something inside you already knows that staying the same is no longer an option. There's a strange kind of silence that appears after everything starts to make sense. Not a silence of peace, but of awareness. It's the moment where you can no longer pretend you don't see it. The pattern, the loop, the structure that once felt like life itself, now exposed for what it really is. And suddenly, the noise that used to guide you loses its authority. The rush feels unnecessary. The pressure feels misplaced. And for the first time, you're not reacting to what's in front of you. You're observing it. That shift is subtle, almost invisible to anyone outside. But inside, something fundamental has already changed. Because now, your life is no longer being dictated by what demands your time, but by what deserves your attention. And those are not the same thing. Solomon understood that most people live responding to demands. Urgent things, immediate things, things that shout. But the things that build rarely shout. They wait. They require presence, not reaction. Vision, not speed. And once you begin to notice that, you start moving differently. You don't rush to say yes anymore. You don't automatically follow the same rhythm. You start pausing, even if just for a second longer than before. And in that pause, something new begins to form. Discernment. Not everything deserves your energy. Not everything deserves your time. Not everything deserves your life. That realization doesn't make you slower. It makes you precise. Because now, instead of spreading yourself across endless effort, you begin to place yourself intentionally in fewer things, in better things, and in things that don't disappear the moment you step away. And that's where the quiet shift becomes visible over time. Not instantly, not dramatically, but undeniably. You start noticing that your days feel different, less rushed, less reactive. There's still movement, still effort, but it's not draining in the same way. Because now, some of what you're doing continues beyond the moment it was created. And that changes how everything feels. You're no longer starting from zero every day. You're building from what already exists. That's what Solomon knew. He wasn't chasing outcomes. He was aligning with principles. Principles that don't depend on urgency, that don't collapse under pressure, that don't disappear when effort pauses. Yes, and those principles create something most people spend their entire lives searching for without knowing what it is. Not money, not success, not status, space. Space to think, space to choose, space to not be controlled by what once felt unavoidable. And once you experience even a small amount of that, everything else starts to look different. The things that once felt essential begin to lose weight. The things that once defined your direction begin to feel optional. And you realize that the life you thought you had to live was only one version of what was possible. Not the only one. Never the only one. And that realization doesn't come with fireworks. It comes quietly, almost like a knowing, that from this point on, you won't move the same way again.